Good evening, everybody. It's great to be with you guys again. I think it's my third time. I'm excited about this study, David's diary, looking at the Psalms here. The Psalms is so many of them, 150 Psalms, that it becomes hard to kind of really dig into the Psalms and to study them. So, I thought, well, one way I could break it down is look at the ones with headers. And we'll talk about those headers specifically, but and then we're going to be even more specific over the next 5 weeks. We're looking at the headers that describe specific events. So that's really the idea. I'll just jump into my slides here because I want to get to the purpose of it. So do that. Because we know the Psalms, I guess I know them as a book of the Bible, but it's been interesting thinking of them specifically as David's diary. Most of these Psalms, it's too general to say that all the Psalms are written by David. There's all sorts of authors listed, and then we assume non-listed because not every Psalm comes from David, but the Psalms we're going to look at, they do. The Psalms we're going to look at are all Psalms of David, and it will specifically say that. And since it specifically says that, well, then we know for sure that David is the one that wrote it. So he was a man that would keep a diary. He was a musician and a poet, and would look at someone who would want to take down notes of events that he experienced. I've always liked the idea of keeping a diary personally. It's something I've tried to do a bunch of times. I think probably half a dozen times in my life. I have two currently diaries that I started that only have maybe a week or 2 weeks of regular information in them. But my wife Jessica has kept a diary her whole life, and she still keeps one. And they're really valuable to me, even just as her husband. And actually, I did history in school, and diaries are kind of a really important thing in the study of history as well, because it's a primary source. It tells you what life was actually like at that time. So, and I think it's really cool that Jess has kept this record of her life. And diaries are very popular. I think they're kind of making a comeback today, too, in kind of popular productivity thinking or blogs or websites that they're suggesting that you keep a diary. And so David is also a great man, that kept a diary, and we're thankful to have it. It said this was from the University of Rochester Medical Center. One of the ways to deal with any overwhelming emotion is to find a healthy outlet in which to express yourself, which makes a journal a helpful tool in managing your mental health. Journaling can help manage anxiety, reduce stress, cope with depression. Journaling helps control your symptoms and improve your mood by helping you prioritize problems, fears, and concerns, tracking any symptoms day to day so that you can recognize triggers and learn ways to better control them, and provide an opportunity for positive self-talk and identifying negative thoughts and behaviors. I think that's really interesting, and that's kind of science, I guess, that a lot of that people recognize, especially people who do keep memories. And it makes sense, I think, in what we know of the character of David too, that he would be someone who would do this. We know him as an emotional, passionate person, and we can see all sorts of emotions that he experiences in the stories that we read about. Again, it's unique. It's unique that we have so much of this record of not only so many stories of David's life, but also what he thought about those stories. That's really totally unique in the Bible. We don't have any of the other major Bible characters that we also are told what they were thinking at the time at a later place. But I think, and that's what I love this kind of quote here from the University of Rochester, because I think it fits exactly what David would be doing. I imagine, being running in the rebellion from Saul, being kicked out of the palace, out of working for him, would be pretty stressful. I think he definitely experiences depression when he's hiding in caves, and then working through the problems of when David becomes king, and then eventually the rebellion of his son Absalom. These are all things that I think would definitely, cause really deep emotional kind of grief. I love this quote here from Franz Kafka. In the diary, you find proof that in situations which today would seem unbearable, you lived, looked around, and wrote down observations that the right hand moved then as it does today. I thought that was interesting. Just keeping a record of your life shows that the terrible things that might happen to us individually, whatever the very sad things in our own lives. If you keep the history, if you're always able to look back on how things were, perspective can offer a lot of healing. And those things that cause stress and anxiety and depression, whatever they are, well, seeing that you processed through them and moved through them in the past has to be helpful. And especially, again, David is a character under such high pressure, and I mean that with kind of his work, first as kind of a general for Saul, and then as king. Obviously that's high stress. His own family problems. He has a tough family when he's a kid. Brothers and parents that don't agree with or don't support him, and then his kind of his role model Saul, kind of a father figure to him. I think it's safe to say, turns on him, and then he has problems with wives of his, and then problems he brings on with himself with Bathsheba. There's so many things that we can see and identify, and use David, I think, as an example of how to deal with pressure and stress and anxiety, and this quote, I think, helped tie that there, that a diary is a way to do that. A diary is a way to watch over your own kind of mental health, and then I've been thinking about this for a while, just kind of working on this concept. This is much more general, that spiritual health is akin, it's really equal to mental health. I think having and that's a very general statement, but having an idea that your connection with God and your connection with Jesus Christ and your understanding of where we are in the world and the plan that God has, all these things are absolutely important and huge important factors in how your own thinking is going, and how positive your own thinking and your understanding of your own self and your identity. Now, when I kind of get into this, I don't want to belittle or generalize too much what can be really debilitating diseases of depression, and I think it's wonderful what we can do with counseling and medicine and things to work through kind of very serious problems that we might have. But I think all people, regardless of whether you have a major case of anxiety or something, all people need to be aware of their mental health, no matter how adjusted is maybe the medical term, how adjusted we are. Mental health is still very important, and I love this concept of and I'm kind of chewing on this, that our spiritual health is our mental health. Now, again, I want to repeat that I don't believe that you can just kind of read the Bible and solve your own problems in every case. I think reading the Bible is very important, and everybody should do it. But I don't think that's a prescription for some specific problems. But it still is beautiful, I think, and God recognizes this. So I wanted to read these verses before we kind of come back to David's diary. But so let's look at these 4 verses. We'll go to Philippians 4. Philippians 4. 6 and 7. Do I want to read before that? Let's see. Yeah, let's start in verse 4. Philippians 4, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. Let your forbearing spirit be known to all men. The Lord is near. I like that phrase, that specific phrase, that the Lord is near, because that is key to this idea. And I think David totally understood this, that God is near us. Jesus Christ is near us as well, that there's a... that's a healthy mindset, because that leads to this here in verse 6: be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, shall guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. So, and we have so many things today that we can be anxious about, that we can get, that can cause our anxiety to rise. I mean, even just the news today, when we read the newspaper or look at the TV, there's so many terrible things that we can see and fears that can come up in our mind. But we have to recognize that the Lord is near, that God is near and close to us, and these things are all under His control. And that gives us peace, and the peace of God, which comes in verse 7, that transcends all understanding. Beautiful, beautiful verses to consider. There were so many of these. These are just the first 4 that came to my mind. But I think it's definitely something that God cares about. We have this peace and we have this understanding. Let's look at the 1 Peter verse there, 1 Peter 5. 1 Peter 5, beginning at verse 6, we'll see another verse about anxiety, the specific word anxiety. 1 Peter 5 and verse 6, humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that He may exalt you at the proper time, casting all your anxiety upon Him, because He cares for you. Again, that idea, God is with us, God is stronger than us, and has everything under His control. Is a very healthy mindset. And again, I think I wanted to put these verses first because we will see that David always had this in his mind. David knew that God was with him and behind him. So and would then cast his anxiety onto Him. Let's look at John 14, the third one on that list there. John chapter 14. John chapter 14, verse 27. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Not as the world gives, do I give to you. Let not your heart be troubled, nor let it be fearful. I love that verse because there's a separation there of what God can do for us and what the world can do for us, what any hope outside of God can do for us. It's that it really comes down to that. To that really special peace that He can give us, and that is knowing that He loves us and that He does have a plan for the earth that He created. It's His earth that He created, and He is going to be He's going to be taking care of everything, all the trouble that we see. We don't need to let our hearts be troubled. We can be faithful in God. And this, let's look at the last one here, Matthew 11. This is a healthy mindset. I think this is mental health, is understanding our closeness to God and the power that He has. Matthew 11, 28 and 30. Matthew 11, beginning at verse 28. Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you shall find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my load is light. The big point is that a relationship with God is a wonderful thing, and David is an example to us in that. David has a totally unique and powerful relationship with God. It's a big example to us, and it's made an example by the Psalm. We're told exactly what David thinks in the Psalms, and that's amazing. I had I think he's given lectures here before. My father-in-law, Phil Sweeney, has a quote that he's said to me a few times, that the Psalms are the software for our brain. So it's how we're supposed to think is the Psalms. So when you because that's how David thought. So when you're depressed, well, there's a psalm for that. When you're happy, there's a psalm for that. When you're confused, there's a psalm for that. There's an answer of how we should think. I mean, the epistles and the New Testament have all sorts of verses about how we should act, right? If we want to have a relationship with God. But the Psalms tell us how we should think. It's really a way that we can understand proper mental health, proper mental processing, and that comes from a very faithful man's diary. So studying the Psalms helps us model our own relationships with our God, because I think the relationship that David had with our God is a wonderful model, and thankfully we were given that diary. So I think it's kind of an interesting thing that diaries, I think, are becoming a little bit more popular because people are recognizing how healthy they are, and David gave us that as an example. And then, so looking into that, really the big reason that we would do this, the reason that we would study the Psalms, is this is how we can have a relationship like David's. If we can understand, looking at his life events, looking at the things that happened in his life, how we then can have a relationship similar to the one that he had with our God. So let's do that. We're going to look at specifically the headers, and that's what I wanted to do. So if you let's look at one. Go to Psalm 3, and I'll explain what I'm meaning about these headers, because again they're unique in the Bible. The Psalms are chapters, like we read in all the different chapters in the Bible. But if you go to Psalm 3, you'll see, and you'll see this header. Now, I copied this off the internet. This little blurb I put up on the screen. Psalm 3, English Standard Version. So you know I got that off the internet. There's a big header that says, "Save me, oh my God." And then under that, there's another one that says, "A Psalm of David when he fled from Absalom his son." And then there's verse 1, "O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me." Is that different? So that's just the ESV that has it on the internet. But on my Bible here, I've got a New American Standard little Bible that I'm reading off in front of me. And that one has a different thing. It has a morning prayer of trust in God. So it says Psalm 3 and then morning prayer of trust in God. And then it says a Psalm of David when he fled from Absalom his son. Does anyone else have anything different there?
No.
No? Okay. So yeah, but you see that there's two different headers. So the ESV said, "Save me, oh my God." Psalm 3 said, "Morning prayer of trust in God." And all sorts of translations do this, right? They have these headers ahead of the chapters. They tell you what's going to happen in that chapter. Look at Psalm 4. Psalm 4 has one as well. So you can look just next over in your Bible. It says Psalm 4, "Answer me when I call, to the choir master with stringed instruments, a Psalm of David," and then it goes to verse 1. Well, one of these things is inspired. One of these things, as in the "answer me." Oh, sorry, my dog's barking at the air conditioner. "Answer me when I call," and then "to the choir master with stringed instruments, a Psalm of David." One of those was put in by God when he and David helped David write the Psalms, and the other one is put in by the translator. And the answer is, well, what's in kind of the original text? Now, if you get really technical, you can go on the internet or look on a concordance, and you'll see that there actually is original. So I'm back to Psalm 3. There's original Hebrew words for that header, a Psalm of David when he fled from Absalom his son. I'm not going to pretend to read these Hebrew words, but you can see on the right of the screen or on your handout those Hebrew words. And And then the same again in chapter 4. So these headers that are above the Psalms are inspired. Those are actually in the Bible. Those are in the original text. I think that's really interesting and important. It's essentially, in a way, they're verses in the Bible, and we don't. Sometimes we don't think about them enough. So what I wanted to do is kind of study over these next 5 weeks the Psalms that have headers that tie to events from David. And we're going to look at some other ones that I think we can safely say are tied to events from David. But it is interesting that some of these tell us a specific event. Like if you look back at Psalm 3, it says, a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. So Psalm 3, we're told, is exactly when David wrote that psalm. And I can see a hand. Go ahead.
I just was wondering, are all the headers like that in the text then? All the headers?
Yeah, that's the thing that you need to figure out about your own Bible, because like the Bible will usually print it differently, like one will be italicized and one will be normal or one will be bold or whatever. But yes, every header, everything like that says a Psalm of David is in the text. And do you want to, you can get, there's 50 of them, I'll tell you. I was going to let you guess, but there's 50 of them. So there's a total of 150 Psalms, and there's 50 that have headers. Most commonly, they just tell you the author. Like if you look at, well, a bunch of these early ones do. I'm just looking at my Bible, Psalm 4, Psalm 5, Psalm 6, but a bunch of them, some of them will even just say of David. It won't, yeah, like Psalm 14. If you look over at Psalm 14, for the choir director, a Psalm of David. So we know that David wrote that psalm. Psalm 11 is the same. But Psalm 10, there's no header. So we don't know exactly who wrote Psalm 10. I think it's safe to assume David wrote it. It's stuck in between Psalm 9 and Psalm 11, which are both of David. But yeah, all of those ones that have headers are in the original text. So they were written by David in this case, and tell us sometimes pretty interesting information. But specifically, what we want to look at are these events. So these are Psalms. Again, these are basically diary entries from an actual event in David's life. Pardon?
Go ahead. The screensaver just popped up for some reason.
Oh, okay. So we can learn what David thought about the events in his life. Now that to me is very, very valuable. That's really what we're trying to do over these next 5 weeks, is find out what to think. I already told us about the software, right? Because we want to learn what to think about the events in our life. I mean, I have different things happen to me. You have different things happen to you. We're all on kind of our individual walks here. And we want to know what is it? How should I react to this? What would be the mentally healthy way? What's the spiritually healthy way for me to deal with things? So it's awesome that, and now there's 14 of them. Like I said, there's 14 of these individual Psalms that are tied to specific events in David's life, and we're going to add in a couple more that I think are safe to assume. So that's our mission over these next 5 weeks. So this is how it's going to break down, and we're going to be moving around David's life a little bit, but it should essentially be in order, except for today. Today we're going to go to one kind of near the end of his life. But so today's week 1. We've done kind of our introduction, and then we're going to look at Psalm 3, this one that I use as an example. So we're going to look at David on the run from Absalom, and what Psalm 3 says about that. Week 2, we're going to look at, I'm calling that David on the run, but that's David on the run from Saul, which I already referred to would be a really tough time for him. And then the things get even worse kind of in that time, because he wrote a bunch of Psalms about being in the caves, which I think is kind of a really poetic, a bunch of really poetic psalms about being very low, being even all the way underground. That David dealt with, I think, some pretty serious depression, and we'll see how he processed that in the Psalms. And we'll look at week 4 about David and the wedding. He wrote a beautiful psalm, and then possibly some others about the marriage of his son Solomon. And then the last week we'll look at David in the temple. This is a much more thematic, but David had a concept through his whole life of wanting to be in the temple of God, which is the same thing that we should want. So all these things, I think, will apply to us, and it's been a really, really cool study. So I'm excited for us to go through this. So let's start with one example. We'll start with one psalm, Psalm 3, which we already looked at. Just the header. So let's pull up Psalm 3 if you're not already there. And I'm going to read it. Psalm 3, a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. That makes me think, actually, now that I'm kind of aware of these headers, I really feel it's very appropriate to read them. I think when you come to these psalms, you should include those headers because they are there in the original text. The Psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. O Lord, how my adversaries have increased. Many are rising up against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no deliverance for him in God. But thou, O Lord, art a shield about me, my glory and the one who lifts my head. I was crying to the Lord with my voice, and he answered me from his holy mountain. I lay down and slept. I awoke, for the Lord sustains me. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people who have set themselves against me round about. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for thou hast smitten all my enemies on the cheek. Thou hast shattered the teeth of the wicked. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Thy blessing be upon thy people. And that's Psalm 3. So we have a bunch of concepts from this psalm. I kind of just made a list. Verse 1 talks about many foes, many adversaries that are increased. That's really the same as I think you can lump in verse 6. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people. They say no salvation. And verse 2, that's what the evil many are saying, that there is, those quotes on the screen are all from the ESV. I'm reading from the New American Standard. It says there is no deliverance for him in God, which is an interesting word, deliverance, word difference there. But thou, O Lord, art a shield. God is a shield. And then David says, I was crying aloud to the Lord with my voice, and he answered me from his holy mountain. An interesting idea. Verse 5, I lay down and slept. And then also in verse 5, I awoke, for the Lord sustains me. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God. And then the idea of striking the teeth and the enemies on the cheek. So these are all the concepts that we're going to be looking for when we look at the actual event, because I think it can help this psalm make sense. And then salvation belonging to the Lord. So let's get into that. It's 2 Samuel chapter 15 through 17. So we are going to the end of David's life, near the end of David's life, right here in this first week. But I think it's a fascinating story. David's been king for a long time at this point. All of his children, most of his children, have been born at this, and one of them is named Absalom. He's already had a problem with Absalom by the time we get to chapter 15. Absalom, against the will of David, killed one of his brothers, who had done a terrible thing in chapter 13. But Absalom killed him without the blessing of King David. So there's already been kind of a rift before we get to chapter 15, and we can get into what becomes really the rebellion of Absalom. And this first concept comes right at the start. This first idea of many foes, or many thousands of enemies in the third psalm. So if you look at 2 Samuel 15. right there at the beginning, now it came about after this that Absalom was provided for himself a chariot and horses and 50 men as runners before him. So he had a whole squadron of people that he would keep in front of him. And Absalom used to rise early and stand beside the way to the gate. And it happened that when any man had a suit to come to the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and say, "From what city are you?" And he would say, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel." I want to jump down to verse 10. Absalom has spies, which I think is interesting. In verse 10, it says, Absalom sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then you shall say, Absalom is king in Hebron." In verse 11, then 200 men went with Absalom from Jerusalem, who were invited and went innocently, and they did not know anything. You jump to verse 31. Someone told David, saying, "Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom." So another person becomes one of David's many foes that he would write about. In verse 16, chapter 16, verse 15. Then Absalom and all the people and the men of Israel entered Jerusalem, and Ahithophel with him. So Absalom has all, that quote there is all the people. And then in the beginning of chapter 17, furthermore, Ahithophel said to Absalom, "Please let me choose 12,000 men that I may arise and pursue David tonight." And then verse 25, and all Israel and Absalom camped in the land of Gilead. So we see that verse, what he says in Psalm 3, this idea of many thousands or many foes, that absolutely is true of the story. His son Absalom is rebelling from him, and he has all sorts of enemies and all sorts of people around him. So that I think is that promise. And then they say no salvation, or my version said no deliverance in verse 2. That's what the evil people say. And then in verse 8, David compares that and he says, "No, salvation belongs to the Lord." And I thought it was interesting once we read that psalm, because Absalom sets himself up as a judge. I had started reading it in the beginning of verse 15. Of chapter 15, excuse me. If you come to chapter 15, look again at verse 2, which I had started reading, and we'll read there for a little bit. The way that Absalom sets himself up as an alternative to King David is he starts to become a judge. He says, "From what city are you?" And he said, "From the tribes of Israel." And then Absalom would say to him, "See, your claims are good and right, but no man listens to you on the part of the king." He says, "There is no salvation," right? No man listens to you. Moreover, Absalom, he would say out loud, "Oh, that one would appoint me judge in the land. Then every man who has any suit or cause could come to him, and I would give him justice." I think that, again, that's fascinating, because that's really a contrast to the justice that David would live by, which is the justice of God. So if you look down at verse 6, "And in this manner Absalom dealt with all Israel who came to the king for judgment." So Absalom stole away the hearts of the men of Israel. So it's a fascinating idea that they say no salvation, and that's David reacting to his son ignoring, in a way, the salvation of God or the judgment of God, which had David as king, and setting himself up as some sort of kind of savior for the people. On the other hand, there's 2 times in these 3 chapters, and it's probably difficult for us to jump around here through this story, but it is 3 chapters, so I think we have to kind of stay coming in and out of the story. But if you look at the beginning of 16, David, when he is now, because what happens is Absalom eventually runs David out of Jerusalem. David leaves Jerusalem and goes and kind of runs from Absalom in the countryside before Absalom eventually comes to war with David, and then Absalom is killed by David's general Joab. That's the overall arch of the story. But while David is on the move, while he's on the run from Absalom, he's fed twice by 2 friends. So in a way, I thought that David is saved, right? David is aware that salvation belongs to the Lord, which he said in verse 8. So let's look at that in chapter 16. Now when David had passed a little beyond the summit, behold, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, met him with a couple of saddled donkeys, and on them were 200 loaves of bread, 100 clusters of raisins, and 100 summer fruits, and a jug of wine. And the king said, why do you have these? And Ziba said, the donkeys are for the king's household to ride, and the bread and the summer fruit for the young men to eat, and the wine for whoever is faint in the wilderness. And then look at verse 4. So the king said to Ziba, behold, all that belongs to Mephibosheth is yours. And Ziba said, I prostrate myself. Let me find favor in your sight, O Lord my king. So Ziba shows himself as a friend to David, and his master Mephibosheth wasn't. And then if you look over to chapter 17, it happens again. A man named Shobai. So chapter 17, verse 27. When David had come to Mahanaim, Shobai the son of Nahash from Reba of the sons of Ammon, Machir the son of Ammiel, and Barzillai the Gileadite from Rogelim brought beds, basins, pottery, wheat, barley, flour, parched grain, beans, lentils, parched seeds, honey, curds, sheep, and cheese of the herd for David, and for the people who are with him to eat. But they said, the people are hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness. So it's neat that David, who trusted in God, was offered salvation. He was really saved by his friends there, through the power of God, which I think is a really great contrast. Again, remembering Psalm 3, between Absalom, who takes judgment into his own hands, versus David, who doesn't fight Absalom initially, trusts in God, and then is saved through that. So it said in 2 Samuel 3 that I cried aloud to the Lord. If you look in chapter 15, back to chapter 15 again, right? This is as David is leaving. Chapter 15, verse 14. David said to all his servants who are with him at Jerusalem, arise and let us flee, for otherwise none of us shall escape from Absalom. Go in haste, lest he overtake us quickly and bring down calamity on us and strike the city with the edge of the sword. And then verse 23. While all the country was weeping with a loud voice, all the people passed over. The king also passed over the brook Kidron, and all the people passed over toward the way of the wilderness. And verse 30. And David went up the ascent to the Mount of Olives and wept as he went. And his head was covered, and he walked barefoot. Then all the people who were with him each covered his head and went up weeping as they went. And that's again when he was told that his friend Ahithophel, in the next verse, verse 31, someone told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, Oh Lord, I pray, make the counsel of Ahithophel foolishness. So we see David, as he's leaving Jerusalem, as his son's rebellion grows, he is crying aloud to the Lord. And again, I think this is a faithful action for him to leave. Right, he's avoiding the very awkward and painful conflict with Absalom, and getting out of the city. But all through that, we see he cries, and the people cry aloud. So I think that verse makes sense also in Psalm 3. We know that David cried aloud when he left. So this is fascinating. I think that this is all one day. If you read through chapter 15, and we've read a bunch of it now, and then you get to chapter 16. Because that actually, verse 30 was important, because it said when David went up the Mount of Olives. That's a short walk, actually, from the city of Jerusalem. So all of this is one day's experience. And then we get to verse 14. Well, what happens next, and we'll talk about this guy. I finished the story of Ziba there, chapter 16, verse 4. Now looking at chapter 16, verse 5. When King David came to Bahurim, also very close to Jerusalem, this is just not a day has passed. There comes a man named Shimei. He came out cursing continually as he came, and he threw stones at David and all the servants of King David and all the people and all the mighty men were at his right hand and at his left. And Shimei said, when he cursed, get out, you man of bloodshed and worthless fellow. And then he keeps saying that, and David has an argument with his general Abishai about killing Shimei. Then you get down to verse 13. So David and his men, so I'm in chapter 16, verse 13. David and his men went on the way, and Shimei went along in the hillside, parallel with him. And as he went, he cursed and cast stones and threw dust at him. And the king and all the people were with him arrived weary, and he refreshed himself there. That verse, that idea, refreshed himself, it can sometimes mean sleep, which is really cool, because if we think, if I guess it's a theory, we don't know exactly, but maybe 15 in the first half of 16, that's all one day of David leaving Jerusalem, and it says in Psalm 3 that he slept and awoke. I want to look back. We've left Psalm 3 for a while. Let's look back to Psalm 3, refresh what he's saying. I lay down and slept, and I awoke, for the Lord sustains me. And I think what I was thinking in verse 14, maybe this is the first time he slept after leaving Jerusalem, when his son Absalom has essentially chased him out by starting this rebellion. And he's refreshed in that first night. And what if that was when he wrote the psalm, right? Because this is a psalm of David. The header says this is a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. I mean, it's possible he wrote it after, but it's also possible that he wrote it during this experience while he's running from Absalom. So I think it could be right there in verse 14. He refreshed himself, and then it says there in Psalm 3, verse 5, I lay down and slept. I awoke, the Lord sustains me. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people who have set themselves against me round about. Right? This Psalm 3, if you read it as that, as if he wrote this the morning after he's had this problem with his son, I think it makes sense. And we'll read it again, but let's finish these couple more verses I have here. The idea of God as a shield, or God arising. We'll jump around again. 15 verse 25. The king said to Zadok, return the ark of God to the city, because, well, let's look at verse 24. So look at 15 verse 24. In Psalm 3, David says that God acts as a shield, and he knows that God will arise. And we can see through these 3 chapters that God does take care of him. Now behold, Zadok also came, and all the Levites with him, carrying the ark of the covenant of God. And they sat down the ark of God, and Abiathar came up until all the people had finished passing from the city. And the king said to Zadok, return the ark of God to the city. If I find favor in the sight of the Lord, then he will bring me back again, and show me both it and his habitation. Beautiful that David keeps his trust, knowing that he will someday be back in Jerusalem. And then let's look at chapter 15, verse 31. Hushai is a spy that David sends. Ahithophel. David prays, we already read this, that David prayed that Ahithophel's counsel would be made foolishness. Well, and that actually comes true if we read in chapter 17, in verse 4 through 14. We can, if you read this story in detail, you'll see that Hushai, a friend of David, who was staying in Jerusalem, makes Ahithophel's counsel look foolish, as David had asked God to do. So God does that. So we see that God acts. God is very active in this story, being that shield and that protection for David. There was that weird verse, I pointed it out when we read it in Psalm 3, about striking the teeth and smacking the cheek. And that one took me the longest to find in these 3 chapters. Why would David talk about striking the teeth and smacking the cheek? And I think there is a clear answer, and I think we already read it. If you come back again to Shimei, another character in this story, when David leaves Jerusalem, this man Shimei comes by cursing continually. So chapter 16, verse 5. I'm going to read the whole thing this time. When David came out to Bahurim, behold, there came out from there a man of the family of the house of Saul, whose name was Shimei, the son of Gera. He came out cursing continually as he came. And he threw stones at David and at all the servants of King David, and all the people and all the mighty men were at his right hand and at his left. And thus Shimei said when he cursed, get out, you man of bloodshed and worthless fellow. The Lord has returned upon you all the bloodshed of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. The Lord has given the kingdom into the hand of your son Absalom. And behold, you are taken in your own evil, for you are a man of bloodshed. Well, all of that, verse 8, isn't true. God had not given the kingdom to Absalom. This man Shimei was just being evil, basically, and screaming these things at David. This is not at all what David would want to hear. Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, I'm in verse 9, says, "Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over now and cut off his head." But the king said, "What have I to do with you, O sons of Zeruiah? If he curses, and if the Lord has told him curse David, then who shall say, why have you done so?" He doesn't. David says, "I don't know. Maybe he was told that." We know as the readers that God had not told Absalom, but David obviously is struggling to know what to do. Behold, my son, this is David, "Behold, my son," in verse 11, "who came out from me seeks my life. How much more now this Benjaminite? Let him alone and let him curse, for the Lord has told him. Perhaps the Lord will look on my affliction and return good to me instead of his cursing this day." So David trusts, without taking judgment into his own hand, he trusts in God, assuming that maybe this is a lesson. So David and his men went on his way, and Shimei went along the hillside parallel with him. And as he went, he cursed and cast stones and threw dust at him. Well, I was thinking maybe that's what this verse is in verse 7. Sure, David refuses the idea of having Abishai kill Shimei, this person who's just following behind him, screaming these mean things at him. But that doesn't mean he doesn't want to think it, and that doesn't mean he doesn't trust that God would do it for him. So come back again to Psalm 3, and look at this verse. It says, "Arise, O Lord," verse 7, "Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for thou hast smitten all my enemies on the cheek, thou hast shattered the teeth of the wicked." So David knows that is what God does. God is salvation belongs to the Lord, there in verse 8. God is the judge of people. So when we have enemies, like David had this one in Shimei, there is very real consolation and trust that that God's going to take care of these people who possibly are being evil. God knows more about every situation than we do, and that's what David says. But David in his diary writes, maybe he writes, "Man, I wanted to smack that Shimei guy in the mouth. I wanted to break his teeth and shatter his cheek. I could not express the pain of hearing him follow me around and saying these evil things about me." So I thought that was interesting. I think maybe verse 7 is applying to Shimei and showing the frustration that David would have felt. So let's read Psalm 3 again in total. Now that I ran through that story, and that was definitely tough to slam those 3 chapters in there. But I definitely encourage you to read it, maybe as homework. And compare it here to Psalm 3. But let's look at Psalm 3 again and see if now that we have these little parts of the story in our mind, it may be more beautiful. "O Lord, how my adversaries have increased. Many are rising up against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no deliverance for him in God. But thou, O Lord, art a shield about me, my glory, and the one who lifts my head. I was crying to the Lord with my voice, and he answered me from his holy mountain. I lay down and slept. I awoke, for the Lord sustains me. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people, all those people who are with Absalom, who have set themselves against me round about. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for thou hast smitten all my enemies on the cheek. Thou hast shattered the teeth of the wicked. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Thy blessing be upon thy people." It's a beautiful psalm. I think it's neat to think that was that all of these ideas came from that day, from that time period when he's running away, and he writes them maybe the next morning after he's left Jerusalem, after he's been refreshed, after leaving Shimei, and processes it through in this psalm, giving us a good example of trusting in God's judgment and trusting in God's justice and God's timing. God had not told him what to do about Absalom yet, so David was going to wait for that to come, wait for God to work out his own plan. So yeah, that I think is really neat to see those chapters kind of stretch out Psalm 3 and help us understand more of what's going into David's thinking. So that's it for tonight. Like I said, these are our next classes. We're going to look at David on the run from Saul, which is a similar, but way back at kind of the beginning of his life. So we'll look at that next week, and then move on from there. So yeah, is there any other questions or other thoughts anyone else had?
I was thinking as you were bringing it out that it's cool. I love there's a passage in 2 Corinthians 1 that I always talk about, but that God pairs suffering and comfort in the believer's life, that with suffering that comes into our life, He is the God of all comfort, and He will also bring comfort to our lives. So I think that this story is a really amazing true-to-life example of that, while David is going out of Jerusalem in such a mournful way, like you said, 2 times God sends refreshment and salvation, and of men that met him that were encouraging him and things like that. And I think David was really aware of that and became more aware of that. And I think in our lives, if we realize, I know in my life, often when it's the deepest suffering, it's also the biggest comfort that God brings, both of those. And sometimes we get so focused on the suffering that we forget to really highlight the comfort that He brings. So I think David's good at that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and it's kind of interesting starting, I think, here at the end of David's life. But yeah, definitely by this point, I think he understands to not rush anything. But I say that we're going to talk about David in the caves and on the run from Saul. He also didn't take judgment on Saul in his own hands either. He's really a great example of someone who trusts in God's timing and finds comfort in knowing God.
I think, because I've studied that and really thought a lot about that too, because a lot of times it sounds like David is out for his enemies, but it's really him asking God to take care of his enemies, and we all feel that way. We want to take vengeance sometimes, but vengeance belongs to God. But
right.
Just today I was looking up this verse. There's a prayer of David in 2 Samuel 3, and I think it applies a lot, like when you're talking about Shimei. I didn't forget what Shimei did. And
right.
when Solomon is becoming king, he tells him to take care of Shimei. But David's attitude toward his enemies, I think, is epitomized in 2 Samuel 3:39. May the Lord repay the evildoer according to his evil.
Yeah.
That's sort of what you're saying. He's praying there, and may God smite his enemies on the cheek and shatter their teeth, and leaving that judgment in God's realm, not his. Yeah.
Even though I think he was specific with the judgment that he wanted on Shimei, he says, well, it'd be really great if we could break his teeth after what he was saying to me, but doesn't say that to Abishai. Yeah. Great. All right. Well, I'll close in a prayer then. Papa God, we thank you very much for this time to be together. We thank you for your servant David and all the lessons we can learn from him. We pray in thankfulness for the book of Psalms, and we look forward to exploring more of these things. We pray you'd watch over each of us and keep us safe as we go to our separate homes. We pray this all through Jesus. Amen.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Levi. We appreciate your time and your preparation. So we all look forward to next week.
Yep. We'll see you next week.
Okay. Good night, Levi.